Upon meeting the new cleaner in his mansion, the millionaire was paralyzed when he saw her earrings. The same ones his daughter wore before disappearing 25 years ago. The grand mansion loomed against the afternoon sky, its stone facade casting long shadows over the perfectly manicured lawn. Laura Brooks stood at the iron gates, clutching a worn leather purse. Her heart pounded as she read the sign next to the intercom. Grant Estate. She adjusted her coat, which was more suited for a chilly autumn day than the early spring breeze, and pressed the buzzer. "Name," came a curt male voice through the intercom. "Laura Brooks, I'm here for the housekeeper interview," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The gate creaked open, and Laura stepped onto the cobblestone driveway, feeling small against the estate's grandeur. The pathway led her to the massive oak doors, which opened before she could knock. A middle-aged woman in a sharp black uniform stood there, her eyes scanning Laura from head to toe. "Right this way," the woman said, her tone neutral but her gaze calculating. Laura followed her inside, her worn boots clicking softly against the marble floor. The interior of the mansion was even more intimidating than she'd imagined. Chandeliers sparkled overhead, and every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and aged wood, a sterile yet oddly comforting aroma. The woman led her to a small sitting room just off the main hall. "Mr. Grant will see you shortly," she said, closing the door behind her. Laura sat down, her hands tightly clasped in her lap. She wasn't used to places like this, or people like Nathaniel Grant. She'd only read about him in passing, the kind of man who had his name printed in bold letters in the business section of the newspaper. A real estate mogul with an empire spanning continents, but also a man shrouded in personal tragedy. The door creaked open, breaking her thoughts. A tall, silver-haired man entered, his posture stiff and his expression unreadable. Nathaniel Grant didn't look at her at first. His eyes scanned the room as if searching for something. Then, his gaze landed on her, and it lingered. "Miss Brooks," he said, his deep voice calm but distant. "You're here for the housekeeping position?" "Yes, sir," Laura replied, standing awkwardly. I can start immediately." He motioned for her to sit down again and took a seat across from her. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, his eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze fixating on her ears. "Those earrings," he said abruptly. "Where did you get them?" Laura instinctively reached up to touch one of the simple gold studs. They were unremarkable to her, just a pair of old earrings her mother had given her years ago. "They were a gift," she said, confused by the sudden interest. "From my mom. She passed away." Nathaniel's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Laura caught the brief flicker of something. Recognition, maybe. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in his lap. "I see," he said, his tone unreadable. The air in the room grew heavier, and Laura shifted uncomfortably. She needed this job. Her mother's medical bills had left her in debt, and her younger brother's tuition wasn't going to pay itself. But something about this man's piercing gaze made her want to run out of the mansion and never look back. Nathaniel cleared his throat, snapping her back to the moment. "Do you have experience working in homes like this?" he asked, his tone now formal and detached. "Not exactly like this," Laura admitted, "but I've worked as a cleaner for a few years. I'm reliable and I learn quickly." He nodded slowly. Though his mind seemed elsewhere, after what felt like an eternity, he stood. "You can start tomorrow, Mrs. Peterson will show you to your quarters and explain your duties." Laura blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. "Oh, thank you, sir. Just don't be late," he said curtly, turning and walking toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he stopped and glanced back at her. "Those earrings, don't lose them." Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her alone in the room. Later that evening, as Nathaniel sat in his study, a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk before him, his mind raced. Those earrings, He remembered them vividly, glinting under the sunlight as his daughter Charlotte twirled in the garden all those years ago. She had worn them the day she disappeared. Could it really be a coincidence? He reached for the phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Thomas," he said when the line picked up. "I need your help. There's something I need to know." The study was cloaked in a familiar darkness. the only light coming from the lamp on Nathaniel's mahogany desk. His fingers traced the edge of an old photo frame, its glass smudged from years of handling. Inside was a picture of a young girl, her blonde hair catching the sunlight as she smiled widely at the camera. Charlotte. The name alone was enough to send a sharp pang through his chest. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The memory of her disappearance replayed in his mind like a cruel, endless loop. She had been 7 years old, playing in the garden while he worked in his home office. He'd heard her laughter echoing through the halls, until it didn't. By the time he realized something was wrong, it was too late. The police had found nothing but her favorite doll abandoned on the garden path. The following years were a blur of grief and regret. Vivian, his wife, had blamed him for their daughter's disappearance, accusing him of being more focused on his growing empire than on his family. Their marriage, already strained, crumbled under the weight of their loss. When Vivian died in a car accident 2 years later, Nathaniel was left with nothing but the hollow shell of his life and the vast emptiness of the mansion they had once called home. He had tried to move on, pouring himself into his work, but the guilt never left him. Every day, he wondered what had happened to Charlotte. Was she alive somewhere, wondering why he hadn't come for her? Or had she suffered a fate too horrific to imagine? Nathaniel's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of his phone. He glanced at the screen. Thomas Sawyer. He picked it up immediately. "What did you find?" Nathaniel asked, skipping any pleasantries. "I've just started looking into her," Thomas replied, his voice steady and professional. "It'll take time, but I'll get you answers. Are you sure about this?" "Nathaniel, it could just be a coincidence." "I'm not sure about anything," Nathaniel admitted, rubbing his temples. "But those earrings, they were Charlotte's. I'm certain of it." "I'll dig deeper," Thomas said. "But you should prepare yourself. This could lead nowhere." Nathaniel didn't respond. He couldn't entertain the possibility of this being another dead end. He ended the call and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass as his mind churned. The next morning, Laura arrived at the mansion promptly at 8 a.m. As instructed, she was greeted by Mrs. Peterson, the head housekeeper, who wasted no time outlining Laura's duties. "You'll be responsible for cleaning the east wing," Mrs. Peterson said briskly as they walked through the mansion's endless corridors. "Mr. Grant prefers his study and personal quarters to be immaculate, and don't touch anything on his desk unless instructed." Laura nodded. Clutching the cleaning supplies Mrs. Peterson had handed her, the east wing was even more imposing than the rest of the house, with its high ceilings, ornate moldings, and heavy curtains that let in just enough light to highlight the opulence of the space as she dusted the shelves in the study. Laura's eyes wandered to the photos on Nathaniel's desk. Most of them were of landscapes or business events, but one picture caught her attention. It was a little girl with bright eyes and a radiant smile. There was something eerily familiar about her, though Laura couldn't place why. Her gaze shifted to a small porcelain doll sitting on the bookshelf. Its dress slightly faded but meticulously maintained. It reminded her of a similar doll she'd had as a child, though hers had been lost years ago. Admiring the decor, Laura jumped, nearly dropping her duster. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered. "Gee," stepping back from the desk. "I didn't mean to." "It's fine," he said, walking past her to sit at his desk. "Charlotte loved that doll." "Charlotte?" Laura asked tentatively. "My daughter," he said, his voice quieter now. "She disappeared a long time ago." Laura hesitated, unsure if she should respond. "I'm sorry," she finally said, her voice soft. "That must have been devastating." Nathaniel looked at her, his piercing eyes searching hers as if trying to read her thoughts. For a moment, she felt like he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded. "Get back to work," he said, turning his attention to the stack of papers on his desk. As the days passed, Laura settled into her routine, though Nathaniel's presence always unsettled her. There was something about the way he looked at her, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. She tried to brush it off as paranoia. After all, she was just an employee. Why would someone like Nathaniel Grant pay her any special attention? But she couldn't ignore the sense of unease that crept in every time she caught him staring. It wasn't just his gaze. It was the questions he asked, casual on the surface, but probing in a way that made her feel exposed. Where had she grown up? Who had raised her? Did she remember anything about her early childhood? Laura answered as best as she could, but the truth was, her past was a blur. She had been adopted at a young age, and her adoptive mother had never spoken much about where she'd come from. All she had were a few old photos, a birth certificate with no father's name, and the gold earrings her mother had given her. That evening, as Laura folded laundry in the servants' quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the corridor was empty. Still, the unease lingered. In his study, Nathaniel sat at his desk, the photo of Charlotte in his hand. The resemblance between his daughter and Laura was undeniable. He didn't know if it was fate or a cruel trick, but he was determined to find out the truth. The mansion felt colder that morning, as if the thick walls were holding back secrets too heavy to release. Laura moved quietly through the east wing, her footsteps muffled by the plush rugs. She was starting to learn the rhythms of the house, the exact time the sunlight hit the study windows, the quiet hum of the kitchen staff preparing breakfast, and most unsettling, the moments Nathaniel Grant would appear out of nowhere. This morning was no different. As Laura dusted the bookshelves in the study, Nathaniel entered without a sound. She jumped slightly but quickly composed herself, clutching the feather duster like a shield. "Good morning, Mr. Grant," she said, keeping her tone professional. Nathaniel didn't respond immediately. His eyes went to her earrings again, the subtle glint of gold catching the light. It had become a pattern, his silent fixation, the way his gaze lingered just a moment too long. "Good morning," he finally said, his voice measured. "Have you always worn those earrings?" Laura frowned, her hand instinctively brushing against her ear. "I suppose so," she said. "They were a gift from my mother years ago. Did she tell you where she got them?" Laura hesitated. She'd never questioned the earrings' origin before. Her mother had simply handed them to her one day, saying they were special. "No, she didn't," Laura admitted. "Why do you ask?" Nathaniel paused, as if debating how much to reveal. "They're familiar," he said finally. "My daughter had a pair just like them." "Oh." Laura didn't know what else to say. She felt a pang of guilt, as if wearing the earrings was somehow an affront to his loss. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "It's not your fault," Nathaniel interrupted, his tone softening slightly. "It's just strange, that's all." Laura nodded, though she still felt uneasy. She wanted to escape the room, to shake off the weight of his scrutiny, but her duties kept her rooted there. She continued dusting in silence, aware of Nathaniel's presence in the corner of her vision. In the days that followed, the questions didn't stop. Nathaniel's inquiries became more pointed, though he never crossed the line into outright interrogation. Where had she grown up? What was her adoptive mother like? Did she have any memories of her early childhood? "At first," Laura answered politely, chalking up his curiosity to harmless small talk. But the more he pressed, the more unsettled she became. There were too many gaps in her past, too many questions she couldn't answer. Her mother had always been vague about her adoption, insisting that it didn't matter where Laura had come from, only where she was going. But now Laura was starting to wonder if her mother had been hiding something. Nathaniel's study became a haven for his restless thoughts. He spent hours poring over old photo albums, police reports, and newspaper clippings from the days following Charlotte's disappearance. The image of Laura's earrings was burned into his mind, a beacon pulling him deeper into the labyrinth of his memories. He couldn't ignore the resemblance anymore. Laura's features, the shape of her face, the way her smile curved ever so slightly to one side, were painfully familiar. He hadn't noticed it at first, but now it was all he could see, driven by a mixture of hope and desperation. Nathaniel picked up the phone and dialed Thomas Sawyer. "Thomas," he said, his voice heavy with urgency. "I need you to dig deeper. The girl, Laura Brooks. I need to know everything about her, where she's from, who her family was, where she's been." "Understood," Thomas replied. "I'll call you as soon as I find anything." Nathaniel hung up and leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the porcelain doll on the bookshelf. It was the last gift he'd given Charlotte before she disappeared, and it had remained untouched ever since. Now, it seemed to stare back at him, as if urging him forward. One evening, as Laura cleaned the dining room, Mrs. Peterson approached her with an envelope. "This came for you," the housekeeper said, her tone as brisk as ever. "For me," Laura asked, surprised. She rarely received mail. Mrs. Peterson nodded and left without another word. Laura wiped her hands on her apron and opened the envelope, pulling out a folded letter. Her stomach tightened as she read the words. It was from her landlord, a polite but firm reminder that her rent was overdue and that she had 2 weeks to pay before facing eviction. Laura crumpled the letter in her hand, her chest tightening. She had taken this job to get back on her feet, but the bills were piling up faster than she could handle. Her mother's medical expenses and her brother's tuition were bleeding her dry. Now, the roof over her head was at risk too. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. She couldn't let this distract her. Not here. Not now. But as she resumed her cleaning, her mind raced with worries. Meanwhile, Nathaniel paced his study, waiting for Thomas's call. When the phone finally rang, he snatched it up on the first ring. "I've got something," Thomas said. "It's not much, but it's a start." Laura Brooks was registered at St. Mary's Home in Boston as a toddler. No birth parents listed, just her adoptive mother. But here's the thing. The date she was brought to the orphanage matches the timeline of Charlotte's disappearance. Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What else?" "That's all I have for now," Thomas said. "I'll keep digging." Nathaniel hung up, his mind spinning. It wasn't proof, but it was more than a coincidence. He needed to know more, needed to be sure, and there was only one way to do that. That night, as Laura lay in her small room in the servants' quarters, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Nathaniel's questions, the strange intensity in his eyes, the landlord's letter weighing on her mind. It was all too much. She stared at the ceiling, wondering what secrets the Grant mansion was hiding. In his study, Nathaniel stared at the photo of Charlotte on his desk, a glimmer of hope mingling with the ever-present ache of loss. The answers felt closer now, just out of reach, but he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The gray sky hung low as Nathaniel's car pulled into the driveway of St. Mary's Home, an unassuming brick building nestled in the heart of Boston. The orphanage looked much the same as he remembered from decades ago, with its chipped paint and modest garden that seemed out of place in the bustling city. The memories it stirred were painful. A younger Nathaniel, full of desperation, pleading with the staff to keep an eye out for his missing daughter. He adjusted his coat and stepped out of the car, bracing against the chill in the air. Thomas Sawyer was already waiting for him at the entrance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his trench coat. "Thanks for meeting me," Nathaniel said, his voice subdued but resolute. "I figured you'd want to see this for yourself," Thomas replied, leading the way inside. The interior of the orphanage smelled of cleaning supplies and faintly of old books. Children's voices echoed from the hallways, a stark contrast to the solemnity etched on Nathaniel's face. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman in her 60s, greeted them warmly. "Mr. Grant, Mr. Sawyer," she said, glancing between the two men. "I pulled the files you requested. Please follow me." She led them to a small office cluttered with papers and old photographs. On the desk sat a single manila folder with Laura Brooks's name scrawled across the top in faded ink. Nathaniel reached for it, his hands steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. Opening the folder, he saw a grainy black and white photo of a young girl, no older than 2, with wide eyes and a hesitant smile. Beneath the photo was a sparse file detailing her arrival at the orphanage. No birth certificate. No parents listed. Found outside St. Mary's on a rainy night in late October. October, Nathaniel murmured, his throat tightening. That was the month Charlotte had disappeared. Thomas leaned over his shoulder, scanning the document. She was adopted a year later by Margaret Brooks. No mention of how she ended up here. Nathaniel flipped through the pages, searching for answers that weren't there. There has to be more. Someone must remember how she got here. The receptionist, who had been quietly observing, cleared her throat. If I recall correctly, the matron who ran the orphanage back then was Sister Catherine. She's retired now, but she still visits occasionally. I can try to contact her. Please do, Nathaniel said, his voice tight with urgency. Anything she can tell us could help. Back at the mansion, Laura was oblivious to Nathaniel's visit to the orphanage. She was busy scrubbing the marble floor of the foyer, her mind preoccupied with the mounting pressures in her life. The landlord's letter weighed heavily on her, and though she tried to focus on her work, Her thoughts kept drifting to ways she could scrape together enough money to stay afloat. Mrs. Peterson walked by, her sharp eyes scanning the room. "You missed a spot," she said, pointing to a faint streak near the corner. "Yes, ma'am," Laura replied, biting back her frustration. She leaned down and scrubbed harder, wishing she could disappear into the floor. As the day wore on, Laura noticed a subtle shift in the household. The other staff whispered more than usual, their glances toward her lingering just a moment too long. She caught snippets of conversation as she passed them in the hallways. Strange how he keeps asking about her. "Didn't you see him staring at her this morning?" Laura tried to ignore it, but the unease settled deep in her chest. Was Nathaniel talking about her behind her back? And if so, why? That evening, Nathaniel returned to the mansion, his mind racing with possibilities. The file from St. Mary's hadn't given him the answers he needed, but it had brought him closer. He couldn't shake the image of the little girl in the photo. The resemblance to Charlotte was undeniable as he entered the foyer. He found Laura cleaning the staircase. She glanced up briefly, offering a polite smile, but her expression faltered when she saw the intensity in his eyes. "Miss Brooks," Nathaniel said, his voice measured. "A moment, please." Laura hesitated, setting down her cleaning supplies. "Of course, sir." He gestured for her to follow him into the study. Once inside, he closed the door and motioned for her to sit. Laura perched on the edge of a chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Nathaniel began, leaning against the desk. "You mentioned that your mother gave you those earrings. Did she ever tell you where they came from?" "No," Laura said, her voice cautious. "She just said they were important. Why do you keep asking about them?" Nathaniel paused, searching for the right words. "Because they belong to my daughter. She was wearing them the day she disappeared." Laura stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. I don't know what to say. Do you remember anything about your life before your adoption?" he pressed. "Anything at all?" Laura shook her head. "No. My mother told me I was adopted when I was a baby, but she never talked about it. I always assumed she didn't know much herself." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I see, thank you for telling me." Laura stood, unsure if she was being dismissed. "Sir, is there something I should know? You've been watching me, asking questions. It's making me uncomfortable." Nathaniel straightened, his face softening slightly. "I'm sorry if I've made you feel that way, it's just, you remind me of someone." Without another word, he turned and walked to the window. Leaving Laura standing there, confused and uneasy, she left the study quietly, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Later that night, Nathaniel sat alone in his study, the file from St. Mary's spread out before him. His thoughts churned as he stared at the photo of the little girl. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to ignite a fragile hope within him, a hope he hadn't dared to feel in years. In her room, Laura lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Nathaniel's words echoed in her mind. "You remind me of someone." She didn't know who or what he was searching for, but something told her it was far bigger than she realized. Laura woke early the next morning, the faint glow of dawn filtering through the small window of her room in the servants' quarters. Her sleep had been restless, her dreams fragmented and filled with unsettling images. A little girl crying, a stormy night, and a voice calling her name, though she couldn't see the person it belonged to. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the sink. Her mind kept circling back to Nathaniel's words the night before. "You remind me of someone." His questions about her past, his fixation on her earrings, it all felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. With a deep breath, she pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the day ahead. She had work to do, and her landlord's warning letter was a constant reminder that she couldn't afford to lose this job. The kitchen was already buzzing when Laura entered, the clatter of pots and pans blending with the chatter of the staff. She tied her apron and set to work, but the usual camaraderie among the employees felt different today. Whispers followed her as she moved through the room, their eyes darting away when she looked their way. "Did you hear what Mr. Grant said about her?" One voice murmured. "He's definitely hiding something," another replied. Laura clenched her jaw and ignored them, focusing on scrubbing a particularly stubborn stain on the counter. She didn't have time for gossip, especially not when it was about her. Later that morning, Laura was assigned to clean one of the guest rooms in the East Wing. As she dusted the furniture, her mind drifted to her childhood. She'd never thought much about her adoption. Her mother, Margaret Brooks, had always been loving and supportive, even if she was secretive about certain things. Growing up, Laura had accepted that her life started the day Margaret brought her home from the orphanage. She never felt the need to dig deeper. Until now, she remembered the earrings vividly. Margaret had given them to her on her 10th birthday, presenting them in a small velvet box with a tenderness that Laura hadn't questioned at the time. "These belong to someone very special," Margaret had said, her voice thick with emotion. "Now, they're yours." Laura had assumed they were a family heirloom, a relic from Margaret's own past. But hearing Nathaniel's claim that they had belonged to his daughter shook that belief to its core. Could Margaret have known something she never shared? And if so, why had she kept it a secret? Meanwhile, Nathaniel was pacing his study, the file from St. Mary's still spread out on his desk. He hadn't slept much, his mind consumed by the fragments of evidence pointing to the impossible. Laura's resemblance to Charlotte, the timeline of her arrival at the orphanage, the earrings. It all fit too perfectly. The sound of his phone ringing broke his thoughts. He snatched it up, his heart pounding. "Nathaniel," Thomas said on the other end. "I spoke with Sister Catherine. She remembers the night Laura arrived at the orphanage. Says it was unusual." "How so?" Nathaniel asked, his voice taut. "She was left at the door in the middle of the night, soaking wet. No note, no explanation, just a baby in a basket. Sister Catherine said she always found it odd, but she never had reason to question it further." Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. Did she say anything else? Only that the woman who left the baby was wearing a hooded coat. Catherine never got a good look at her face. Nathaniel sank into his chair, his mind racing. If Laura really was Charlotte who had taken her, and why? The answers felt maddeningly close, yet still out of reach. "Keep digging," Nathaniel said. "I need to know everything." That afternoon, Laura found herself alone in the mansion's library. Tasked with organizing the bookshelves, she welcomed the solitude, hoping it would give her a chance to clear her head. But as she worked, her thoughts kept drifting back to Margaret. There had always been things that didn't quite add up about her childhood. The way Margaret avoided questions about the past, the lack of baby pictures, the vague answers about where she'd come from. Laura pulled a heavy leather-bound book from the shelf, but as she turned to set it down, something slipped from between its pages. A small photograph fluttered to the floor. She bent to pick it up, her brow furrowing as she studied the image. It was an old photo of a little girl sitting on a swing, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and her expression was one of pure joy. Something about the girl's face sent a shiver down Laura's spine. It was eerily familiar. She turned the photo over, and her heart skipped a beat. Written on the back, in neat cursive, was a single word: Charlotte. Nathaniel entered the library moments later, pausing when he saw Laura holding the photograph. His face tightened, but he quickly composed himself. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. "It fell out of a book," Laura said, holding it out to him. "Is this your daughter?" Nathaniel took the photo, his eyes lingering on the image. "Yes," he said quietly. "That was Charlotte, not long before she disappeared." Laura swallowed hard, her mind racing. The girl in the photo looked so much like her own childhood pictures. The same bright eyes, the same unruly curls. She felt a strange, almost dizzying sense of connection, but she couldn't explain why. "Mr. Grant," she began hesitantly, "do you think I could be her?" Nathaniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." That night, as Laura lay in bed, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her. For the first time in her life, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that she wasn't who she thought she was. The idea terrified her, but it also sparked a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. In his study, Nathaniel stared at the photo of Charlotte on his desk, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a picture. He didn't know if he was ready for the answers, but he was certain of one thing: he wouldn't stop until he uncovered the truth. The following morning, Nathaniel sat in his study, the sunlight cutting through the heavy drapes and casting sharp lines across the desk. His eyes scanned the scattered papers and photographs spread before him. pieces of a puzzle that he was growing increasingly desperate to solve. Thomas Sawyer had sent over more documents from St. Mary's Orphanage, each one shedding faint light on Laura's past, but leaving even more questions unanswered. Nathaniel flipped through the stack, pausing at a letter dated October 1998. It detailed the orphanage's acceptance of an abandoned baby, along with a note about the distinctive earrings she'd been wearing. The letter made his breath catch. Earrings, the same ones that Laura now wore, the same ones he had given to Charlotte on her 7th birthday. Nathaniel's hand hovered over the phone, his fingers brushing the keys before he finally dialed Thomas. "I need you to do something," Nathaniel said the moment Thomas answered. "Look deeper into Margaret Brooks. I want to know everything about the family that adopted Laura." "You think she knew something?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted, his voice heavy. "But she gave Laura those earrings. She had to know where they came from." "I'm on it," Thomas replied. "I'll get back to you soon." Nathaniel ended the call and leaned back in his chair, the tension in his chest refusing to loosen. He knew he was on the edge of uncovering something monumental, but the waiting was excruciating. Meanwhile, Laura was cleaning the grand dining room, her movements mechanical as her mind churned with questions. The photograph she'd found in the library was burned into her memory. The resemblance between herself and Charlotte impossible to ignore, but even more unsettling was Nathaniel's quiet intensity, his piercing gaze. Whenever their paths crossed, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was holding something back, something that could upend everything she thought she knew about herself. The thought both frightened and intrigued her as she dusted the ornate chandelier. Mrs. Peterson entered the room, her sharp eyes immediately honing in on Laura. "Miss Brooks," she said curtly. "Mr. Grant wants to see you in the study." Laura's stomach tightened. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Mrs. Peterson through the maze of hallways, her footsteps echoing faintly against the polished floors. When she entered the study, Nathaniel was standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned when she stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "Close the door," he said. Laura did as she was told, her pulse quickening. She stood near the edge of the room, her hands nervously gripping the hem of her apron. "I've been looking into your past," Nathaniel began, his voice steady but charged. "There are things about you, about your adoption, that don't add up." Laura's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel gestured to the desk, where the documents from St. Mary's were laid out. "Your records from the orphanage. They say you were abandoned outside St. Mary's in October 1998. That's the same month my daughter disappeared." Laura blinked, her mind racing. I don't understand. Are you saying—" "I don't know yet," Nathaniel interrupted, his voice softening slightly. "But the earrings you wear, they were my daughter's. And there's something else." He picked up the photograph she'd found in the library and held it out to her. "This is Charlotte. My Charlotte." Laura stared at the photo, her hands trembling. The girl in the picture could have been her as a child. The resemblance was uncanny. "This doesn't make any sense," Laura whispered. "I was adopted. My mother, Margaret Brooks. She never said anything about this, which is why I've asked someone to look into her," Nathaniel said. "I'm not accusing her of anything, but I need answers, don't you?" Laura's head swam. She wanted to argue, to deny the possibility, but deep down, she couldn't ignore the truth staring back at her. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel hesitated. "The next step is a DNA test. It's the only way to be sure." Laura looked at him, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "And if I'm not her, if I'm not Charlotte?" Nathaniel's expression softened, and for a moment, the weight of his grief was evident in his eyes. "Then we'll know," he said quietly. "But if you are, it changes everything." That night, Laura lay awake in her small room staring at the ceiling. The idea of taking a DNA test terrified her, not because she feared the truth, but because of what it might mean for her identity. If she really was Charlotte Grant, everything she'd known about her life would be a lie. The thought was as exhilarating as it was devastating. Across the mansion, Nathaniel sat in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey. The photograph of Charlotte was propped against a stack of documents, and he couldn't take his eyes off it. For the first time in years, he felt something other than grief, a fragile, almost unbearable hope. The next morning, Nathaniel arranged for the DNA test. A nurse came to the mansion to collect samples, her professionalism doing little to ease the tension in the room. Laura sat across from Nathaniel, her hands trembling slightly as the nurse swabbed her cheek. Nathaniel's expression was calm, but his tightly clenched fists betrayed his nerves. "It'll take a few days," the nurse said as she packed up the samples. "You'll receive the results as soon as they're processed." "Thank you," Nathaniel said. His voice clipped as the nurse left. Laura stood, her legs feeling unsteady. "I need some air," she muttered, heading for the garden before Nathaniel could respond. In the garden, Laura sat on a stone bench, the cool air helping to clear her head. She tried to reconcile the pieces of her past with the possibility that she might not be who she thought she was. The earrings, the photograph, the timeline. It all pointed to something bigger than she could understand. Back in his study, Nathaniel stared out the window, watching Laura from a distance. He felt the weight of the past pressing down on him, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness. The wait for the results would be unbearable, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever the truth turned out to be, it would change both their lives forever. The days following the DNA test dragged on with an unbearable weight. Each hour felt like a lifetime, as both Nathaniel and Laura struggled with the possibilities that loomed ahead. The mansion, once steeped in an almost indifferent silence, now buzzed with an undercurrent of tension. The staff whispered behind closed doors, the weight of the unspoken hanging thick in the air. Nathaniel had taken to pacing his study, his mind a maelstrom of thoughts. Every time he looked at Laura, he saw pieces of Charlotte staring back at him, the curve of her smile, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. But he knew better than to cling to hope until he had the results in hand. Laura, on the other hand, had retreated inward, her normally kind and approachable demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity. She found herself questioning every memory she had of her mother. Margaret, was her childhood as idyllic as she'd believed, or had her mother hidden the truth all along? On the third morning after the test, Laura was cleaning the grand staircase when Mrs. Peterson approached her with a rare expression of unease. "Mr. Grant has requested your presence in the study," she said, her tone less brusque than usual. Laura froze, her heart pounding. "It's the results," she thought. She nodded and handed off her cleaning supplies to another staff member before heading down the corridor. Her legs felt like lead as she approached the heavy door to the study. Inside, Nathaniel was seated at his desk, the envelope containing the test results resting in front of him. He looked up as Laura entered, his expression unreadable. "Close the door, please," he said. Laura obeyed, her hands trembling as she stood across from him. "Is that—" she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel nodded and gestured to the envelope. The results came this morning. Neither of them moved for a moment, the weight of what lay inside hanging between them like a storm cloud. Finally, Nathaniel took a deep breath and picked up the envelope. He opened it with deliberate care, unfolding the papers inside. His eyes scanned the results, and for a moment, his expression didn't change. Then, slowly, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, something between relief and devastation. "It's a match," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're Charlotte. You're my daughter." The words hit Laura like a thunderclap. She sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "That can't be. I mean, how? My mother never—" "She must have known," Nathaniel interrupted gently. "Those earrings, the timing of your adoption. She must have known." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she tried to process what he was saying. "But why wouldn't she tell me? Why keep this from me?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his expression softening. "Maybe she thought she was protecting you, or maybe she didn't know the whole truth herself. I can't speak for her. But what I do know is that you're my daughter, Charlotte." The word felt foreign to her, like it didn't belong. "I don't even know who I am anymore," Laura said, her voice breaking. "Am I Laura, or am I Charlotte? I feel like my whole life has been a lie." Nathaniel's heart ached at the pain in her voice. He wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that it didn't matter, that she was still the same person she'd always been, but he knew that wouldn't erase the confusion and hurt she was feeling. "You're both," he said quietly. "Laura and Charlotte. Your past doesn't change who you are. It just adds to your story. The revelation left both of them emotionally drained. Nathaniel allowed Laura to leave the study, giving her space to process the news. She retreated to her room, where she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. Memories of her mother flooded her mind, mingling with the image of the little girl in the photograph. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Mrs. Peterson, holding a small, dusty box. "Mr. Grant asked me to bring this to you," she said, setting the box on the bed. "He thought you might want to see it." Laura waited until Mrs. Peterson left before opening the box. Inside, she found relics of a childhood she didn't remember. Drawings, small toys, and a bundle of photographs. Her eyes filled with tears as she picked up a picture of a younger Nathaniel holding Charlotte in his arms. His face was filled with the kind of joy she'd never seen in him before. The photos stirred something deep within her, a faint flicker of recognition that she couldn't quite place. She had always felt like a piece of her was missing, and now she knew why. Nathaniel, meanwhile, was in his study, staring out the window. The confirmation that Laura was Charlotte had brought a flood of emotions: relief, guilt, and an overwhelming need to make up for lost time. But as much as he wanted to celebrate the reunion, he couldn't ignore the questions that lingered. Who had taken Charlotte, and why had she been abandoned at St. Mary's? His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Thomas. "I found something," Thomas said without preamble. "An old employee of yours, Robert Parker. He left the mansion shortly after Charlotte disappeared. I tracked him down. He's in a hospice in New Jersey. Says he has something to confess." Nathaniel's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "He wouldn't give details over the phone, but it sounds big. If you want answers, you'll need to go see him." Nathaniel ended the call and stood, his mind racing. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Grabbing his coat, he headed for the door, determination etched into his features. "Miss Peterson," he called as he passed through the hall. "I'm going out. Let Laura, Charlotte, know I'll be back soon." As he stepped outside, the crisp air hit his face. Sharpening his resolve, he had spent 25 years haunted by questions. But now, the truth was within reach, and he wouldn't rest until he had it. Nathaniel drove in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound as he made his way to the hospice in New Jersey. His thoughts swirled with anticipation and dread. Thomas's call had ignited a spark of determination in him, but he couldn't shake the sinking feeling that whatever Robert Parker had to say would come with its own set of complications. The hospice was a modest building nestled between a grove of trees, its simplicity a stark contrast to the grandeur Nathaniel was accustomed to. He stepped inside and was greeted by a nurse who led him down a quiet corridor. "Mr. Parker doesn't have much time," the nurse said gently, "but he's lucid and has been expecting you." Nathaniel nodded, his jaw tightening as they approached a small room at the end of the hall. Inside, Robert Parker lay in a hospital bed, his frail body almost unrecognizable from the robust man Nathaniel remembered from years ago. His eyes, however, were sharp, and they locked onto Nathaniel with a mixture of guilt and relief. "Nathaniel Grant," Robert croaked, his voice rasping with age. "I wondered if you'd come." Nathaniel stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Thomas said you have something to tell me. Something about Charlotte." Robert's face contorted with emotion, and he gestured weakly for Nathaniel to sit. "I've carried this burden for years," he began. "It's time you knew the truth." The confession spilled out slowly, each word heavy with regret. Robert explained that years ago, he had been desperate for money. A gambling debt had put his life in jeopardy, and he'd made a deal with the wrong people. When he saw an opportunity to take advantage of the Grant's wealth, he had seized it. "I didn't plan for it to go that far," Robert said, his voice breaking. "I was supposed to stage a ransom and return Charlotte once I got the money, but things spiraled out of control." Robert admitted to taking Charlotte from the garden that day, intending to keep her hidden until he received the ransom. But the plan unraveled when his co-conspirators turned on him. They saw an opportunity to sell the child to a wealthy family looking to adopt, cutting Robert out entirely. "I tried to stop them," Robert said, tears streaming down his face. "But they overpowered me. By the time I got away, it was too late. They'd already abandoned her at an orphanage, and I didn't even know which one." Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists as he listened, his chest tight with anger and anguish. "You could have come forward. You could have told the police." "I was a coward," Robert admitted. I thought I could bury the truth and live with it, but I've carried the guilt every day since." Nathaniel stood abruptly, his towering presence filling the room. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said, his voice low but trembling with fury. "The pain you caused my family, the years I spent not knowing if my daughter was alive or dead." Robert flinched under Nathaniel's gaze but didn't look away. "I can't undo what I've done," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I can help you find the people who took her, their names, their connections. It's all written down. Thomas has the file." Nathaniel turned to leave, his emotions a storm raging inside him. At the door, he paused and looked back at the broken man lying in the bed. "I hope you find peace," he said. His tone cold. "Because you've left none for the rest of us." Back at the mansion, Laura was pacing her room, unable to shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. Nathaniel's absence only heightened her anxiety, and she replayed his words from earlier in her mind. "Let me find the answers." When she heard the front door open later that evening, she rushed downstairs, nearly colliding with Nathaniel as he entered. "Where were you?" she asked, breathless. Nathaniel hesitated, his expression guarded. "I went to see someone who might have answers about what happened to you." "And?" Laura pressed, her heart pounding. "Did you find anything?" He sighed, running a hand through his silver hair. "It's complicated. The man who took you, Robert Parker, was one of my employees. He intended to stage a ransom but lost control of the situation. You ended up in the orphanage because of him." Laura stared at him, her mind reeling. "So, everything I thought I knew about my life, it's all because of some twisted plan gone wrong." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze heavy with regret. "I'm so sorry, Charlotte. If I had known—" "Stop calling me that," Laura interrupted, her voice sharp. "I don't even know who Charlotte is. I'm Laura. That's who I've been my whole life." Nathaniel's heart ached at her words, but he understood her turmoil. "You're right," he said softly. "You're Laura, and I don't want to take that from you, but you're also my daughter, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make this right." That night, Nathaniel and Laura sat together in the library, poring over the file Thomas had sent. It contained names, addresses, and connections to the group that had taken Charlotte and sold her to Margaret Brooks. "Your mother might not have known the full story," Nathaniel said, glancing at Laura, "but she must have suspected something. Those earrings, they were too specific to be a coincidence." Laura's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. "What do we do now?" Nathaniel's expression hardened. "We find the people responsible, and we make sure they answer for what they've done." The next steps were clear, but the journey ahead was fraught with uncertainty. As the mansion settled into silence that night, Nathaniel sat alone in his study, his resolve solidifying. He had spent 25 years haunted by guilt and unanswered questions, but now he had a purpose, a chance to reclaim the family he thought he had lost forever. In her room, Laura stared out the window, her thoughts racing. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would set her free. The following day dawned with a muted light that seemed to mirror the heaviness in the air. Nathaniel sat at the dining table with a steaming cup of coffee, his mind preoccupied with Robert Parker's confession. The name and connections in Thomas's file replayed in his head like a haunting melody. He was closer to the truth than ever, yet the weight of knowing what might come next pressed heavily on him. Laura entered the room quietly, her presence almost tentative. She wasn't sure how to act around Nathaniel now. The revelation of her identity had created a rift within her, a tug of war between the life she'd always known and the one she'd just discovered. "Good morning," Nathaniel said, breaking the silence. "Morning," Laura replied, sitting across from him. "Did you sleep?" Nathaniel let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Not really. Too much to think about." "Me too," Laura admitted, fiddling with her mug. "I keep trying to remember something, anything, that connects me to all this, but I can't. It's like my mind won't let me go back that far." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You've been through more than most people can imagine. It's going to take time to make sense of it all." Laura nodded but didn't respond. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion, cutting through the quiet. Moments later, Mrs. Peterson entered with a package in her hands. "This just arrived," she said, setting it on the table before retreating. Nathaniel frowned as he picked it up. The return address was from the hospice. His stomach tightened. Inside the envelope, he found a single sheet of paper with Robert Parker's shaky handwriting. "Nathaniel, I don't know if these words will bring you peace or more pain, but I couldn't leave this world without telling you everything. The men who took Charlotte, those men didn't just betray me. They used her as a pawn in something bigger. Margaret Brooks. She wasn't an innocent bystander. She knew who Charlotte was. She wanted a child and was willing to pay for her. No questions asked. I don't know how much she knew about your family, but she must have suspected. The earrings were her way of covering her tracks, hoping you'd never connect the dots. I'm sorry for the years I've stolen from you. I hope this brings you closer to the truth." Robert Nathaniel's hand trembled as he set the note down. He couldn't process the mix of emotions swirling within him: anger, betrayal, and an aching sadness for both himself and Laura. Margaret, the woman who had raised Laura with love and care, had been complicit in the very act that tore his family apart. "What does it say?" Laura asked, her voice hesitant. Nathaniel hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but she deserved the truth. "It's from Robert," he said. Margaret might have known more than she let on. Laura blinked, the words sinking in slowly. "What do you mean?" Nathaniel handed her the note as she read it. Her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That can't be true, my mom. She wasn't like that. She loved me. I'm sure she did," Nathaniel said gently. "But love doesn't erase what she might have done to get you. She must have been desperate." Laura pushed the note away, her hands shaking. "No, she wouldn't. She couldn't." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Laura couldn't stop thinking about her mother, about the life they had shared. The idea that Margaret had knowingly taken part in something so cruel was incomprehensible to her. Nathaniel, meanwhile, threw himself into action. He contacted Thomas, who confirmed the validity of Robert's claims. The connections led back to a shadowy adoption ring that had operated in the area during the late 1990s, an illegal network that exploited desperate families and children for profit. "There's one more name on the list," Thomas said during their call. "Vivian Harper. She was an intermediary in several cases involving children sold to wealthy families. If anyone can confirm what Margaret knew, it's her." "Where is she now?" Nathaniel asked. "She's in Boston," Thomas replied. "I've sent you her address." Nathaniel hung up, his resolve hardening. He would go to Boston and confront this woman. The answers were within reach, and he wouldn't stop until he had them. Before leaving for Boston, Nathaniel found Laura sitting in the garden. She looked up as he approached, her expression wary. "I need to go to Boston," he said. "There's someone who might have answers about what happened to you." Laura hesitated, then stood. "I want to come with you." "Are you sure?" Nathaniel asked. "This might not be easy to hear." "I'm tired of not knowing," Laura said firmly. "If there's more to this, I need to see it for myself." Nathaniel nodded. "Then let's go." The drive to Boston was tense but quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. When they arrived at the modest apartment building where Vivian Harper lived, Nathaniel's heart pounded. He knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it opened. Vivian was an older woman with tired eyes and a guarded demeanor. She froze when she saw Nathaniel, her expression shifting to one of recognition. "You're Nathaniel Grant," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. "I wondered if you'd ever come." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Then you know why I'm here." Vivian stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "I knew this day would come," she said. "I'll tell you everything." Vivian's confession was both horrifying and illuminating. She confirmed that Margaret had approached the adoption network, desperate for a child. Though Margaret might not have known every detail, she had to have understood that Laura hadn't come to her through legal means. "She didn't ask questions," Vivian said. "She just wanted a baby and she was willing to pay." Laura sat frozen, her hands gripping the edges of the chair. "But why the earrings?" she asked. "Why would she give me something that could connect me to all of this?" Vivian sighed. "I think she felt guilty. Maybe she hoped you'd never find out. But part of her must have wanted you to know the truth someday." Nathaniel's fists clenched at his sides. "And you? Why did you help them?" Vivian's eyes welled with tears. I needed the money. I was a single mother, and they offered me more than I'd ever seen in my life. But I regret it every day. The drive back to the mansion was silent. Laura stared out the window, her thoughts a chaotic tangle. She felt as though the ground beneath her had been ripped away, leaving her adrift. Nathaniel glanced at her, his heart breaking for the pain she was enduring. "We'll figure this out," he said softly. "Together." Laura didn't respond, but a part of her wanted to believe him. For the first time, she wasn't facing this alone. The ride back to the mansion was heavy with silence. The revelations from Vivian Harper's confession had shaken Laura to her core, leaving her with more questions than answers. Margaret Brooks, the woman she had loved as her mother, was now part of a tangled web of lies and betrayal. She stared out the car window, watching the city blur into countryside. As Nathaniel's calm demeanor masked his own swirling emotions, as they pulled into the driveway, Nathaniel broke the silence. "We'll need to process this carefully. There's still more to uncover." Laura turned to him, her expression weary but resolute. "I don't even know what to think anymore every time I try to make sense of it. There's another layer to unravel." Nathaniel nodded, his voice steady. "We'll take it one step at a time. You don't have to face this alone." Back inside the mansion, Laura retreated to her room, craving solitude. She sat on the edge of her bed, pulling the worn velvet box containing the earrings from her nightstand. They had always felt like a small but significant part of her identity, a connection to Margaret's love. Now, they felt like evidence, proof of a truth Laura wasn't sure she wanted to claim. As she held the earrings, a memory surfaced, fleeting and fragmented, like a flash of light through fog, a pair of hands fastening the earrings onto her tiny earlobes, a soft voice whispering, "These will keep you safe." The image vanished as quickly as it came, leaving Laura with a deep ache in her chest. Was it Margaret's voice, or was it someone else's? Nathaniel, meanwhile, was in his study, poring over Thomas's latest findings. The network of people connected to Charlotte's disappearance stretched farther than he had anticipated. Vivian had been one link, but there were others, middlemen and brokers who had profited from the illegal adoptions. Most had vanished, but one name stood out: Gregory Hall, a man who had acted as a go-between for families and the adoption network. According to Thomas, Gregory was still alive, living under the radar in a remote part of Connecticut. Nathaniel's resolve hardened. He needed to confront Gregory, to demand answers. He hesitated only for a moment before dialing Thomas. "I'm going to Connecticut," he said. "Send me everything you have on Gregory Hall." "Be careful," Thomas warned. "These people operated outside the law for a reason. They don't want to be found." "I'm not stopping until I get the truth," Nathaniel replied, his voice resolute. Before leaving, Nathaniel found Laura in the library, her face pale but composed. She was sitting near the large window, staring out at the gardens. "I'm heading to Connecticut," Nathaniel said. "There's another person I need to speak with, someone who was directly involved in the adoption network." Laura turned to him, her eyes tired but determined. "I'm coming with you." Nathaniel hesitated. "This could be dangerous. I don't know what we'll find." "I don't care," Laura said firmly. "I can't sit here and wait for you to bring back pieces of my life. I need to face this, no matter what it is." Nathaniel studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but if things get too intense, I need you to trust me to protect you." "I can handle it," Laura replied, her voice steady. The drive to Connecticut was tense, both of them bracing for what might come next. When they arrived at Gregory Hall's isolated cabin, the air was thick with unease. The property was overgrown, the wooden structure weathered and leaning slightly to one side. Nathaniel parked the car, and they stepped out, the crunch of gravel beneath their feet the only sound. Nathaniel knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a long pause, the door creaked open, revealing an older man with sunken eyes and a wiry frame. Gregory Hall looked them over with suspicion, his hand tightening on the edge of the door. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Nathaniel Grant," Nathaniel said, his voice firm. "And this is my daughter. We're here to talk about the adoption network you worked with." Gregory's expression darkened, and he started to close the door. Nathaniel blocked it with his hand. "We're not leaving until you answer our questions." Gregory hesitated, then sighed heavily. "Fine, come in, but make it quick." The cabin's interior was cramped and dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale tobacco. Gregory motioned for them to sit at a rickety table, then poured himself a drink. "You're digging into something you shouldn't," Gregory said, his tone wary. "That network's been gone for years. Nothing left to find." "There's plenty left to find," Nathaniel said sharply. "My daughter was taken because of people like you. I want to know who was behind it." Gregory's eyes flicked to Laura, lingering for a moment before he spoke. "I didn't take her. I was just a middleman. Families like yours were targeted because they had something to lose. The ones who orchestrated it were careful, always staying in the shadows." "Names," Nathaniel demanded. "Give me names." Gregory hesitated, then took a long drink before answering. "The head of the operation went by the name Whitman. I never met him, but he controlled everything. Who got taken, where they went. He made sure we couldn't trace anything back to him." Nathaniel's fists clenched. "Where is he now?" "No one knows," Gregory said. "He disappeared years ago, but if you're smart, you'll let this go. People who dig too deep don't come back." Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "I've spent 25 years searching for my daughter. I'm not stopping now." Gregory met his gaze, something like pity flickering in his eyes. "Then you'd better be ready for what you find." As they left the cabin, the weight of Gregory's words settled heavily on both Nathaniel and Laura. The name Whitman felt like a key to a door they weren't sure they wanted to open. But as they drove back to the mansion, one thing was clear. The search for answers was far from over. The drive back to the mansion was weighed down by the revelations at Gregory Hall's cabin. Nathaniel's knuckles gripped the steering wheel as he replayed the name Whitman in his mind. He had spent decades haunted by unanswered questions. And now he was closer than ever to the heart of the conspiracy that had stolen Charlotte from him. Beside him, Laura sat silently, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, but her thoughts churned with equal intensity. They reached the mansion as dusk began to settle, painting the estate in muted hues of orange and blue. As they stepped inside, Mrs. Peterson approached, her usually composed demeanor tinged with hesitation. "Mr. Grant," she began, her voice uncertain. "A woman arrived while you were away. She insisted on waiting for you." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Who is she?" Mrs. Peterson glanced nervously toward the drawing room. "She said her name is Vivian." Nathaniel froze for a moment. He thought he'd misheard her. "Vivian," he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Mrs. Peterson confirmed. "She's in the drawing room now." Laura's eyes widened, and she turned to Nathaniel. "Vivian as in your wife." Nathaniel didn't respond. His legs moved of their own accord, carrying him down the hall to the drawing room. His heart raced as he pushed open the door. Seated on one of the elegant sofas was a woman he hadn't seen in over 2 decades. Vivian Grant looked older, her once youthful face now marked by lines of experience and pain, but her piercing blue eyes were the same. She stood as he entered, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's been a long time." For a moment he couldn't speak. The room seemed to tilt, the weight of her presence almost too much to bear. "Vivian," he finally managed, his voice raw. How is this possible? We thought you were dead." Vivian's gaze shifted to Laura, who had entered the room behind Nathaniel. Her breath hitched, and tears welled in her eyes as she took a step closer. "Charlotte," she whispered. "Oh, my sweet girl." Laura stiffened, her mind struggling to process the flood of emotions. "I don't understand," she said, her voice shaky. "How are you alive, and why are you here now?" Vivian hesitated, her eyes darting between Nathaniel and Laura. "I need to explain everything," she said, "but you're not going to like what you hear." As they sat down, Vivian began to recount the events that had led to her disappearance. "After Charlotte was taken," she said, her voice heavy with emotion, "I was consumed with guilt. I blamed myself for not being there, for not protecting her. But it wasn't just guilt. It was fear. I started receiving threats. Nathaniel, letters, phone calls. They warned me to stay silent or they would hurt her." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was scared," Vivian admitted. "And then, one night, there was an accident. My car was forced off the road. I survived, but barely when I woke up in the hospital. They told me it would be safer if the world believed I was dead." I didn't trust anyone, not even you." Nathaniel's hands clenched into fists. "You let me think you were gone. You left me to grieve alone." Tears streamed down Vivian's face. "I thought I was protecting you, protecting Charlotte. I spent years in hiding, trying to find out who was behind it all. But they were always one step ahead." Laura, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Why come back now, after all this time?" Vivian looked at her, her expression softening. "Because I heard whispers that you had been found, that the truth was starting to surface. I couldn't stay away any longer." Nathaniel stood abruptly, pacing the room as he tried to process her words. "Do you know who's behind this?" he asked, his voice sharp. The name Whitman came up. "Is he the one?" Vivian nodded slowly. Whitman was the mastermind. He orchestrated everything. Charlotte's abduction, the threats, even the illegal adoption network. But he was working for someone else. Someone with power and resources. "Who?" Nathaniel demanded. Vivian hesitated, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. "I don't know. That's what I've been trying to uncover all these years." The room fell silent, the enormity of her revelation sinking in. Nathaniel turned to Laura, who was staring at Vivian with a mix of disbelief and longing. "This is too much," Laura said, her voice breaking. "First I find out I'm not who I thought I was. And now this. How am I supposed to process any of it?" Vivian reached for her, but Laura pulled away, tears streaming down her face. "I need air," she said, rushing out of the room. Nathaniel started to follow her, but Vivian stopped him. "Let her go," she said softly. "She needs time." Later that night, Nathaniel found Laura in the garden, sitting on a stone bench beneath the towering oak trees. She didn't look up as he approached, her gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said quietly. "I spent my whole life thinking I was one person, and now I don't even know who I am." Nathaniel sat beside her, his voice gentle. "You're still you, Laura, or Charlotte, whatever name you choose. It doesn't change the person you've become." She turned to him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think we'll ever get to the bottom of this, or will it just be more questions, more pain?" Nathaniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but comforting. "We'll find the truth," he said. "No matter how long it takes or what it costs, you deserve that much." Inside the mansion, Vivian sat alone in the drawing room, her thoughts heavy. She had spent years running from her past, but now she was determined to face it. She had returned to protect her family, and she wouldn't stop until the people responsible for their pain were brought to justice. The atmosphere in the mansion felt heavier after Vivian's revelation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Nathaniel, Laura, and Vivian avoided each other for most of the morning, each lost in their thoughts. The weight of the past was almost suffocating, but the need for answers pressed relentlessly on all of them. Nathaniel sat in his study, a single name consuming his mind. Whitman. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the dossier Thomas had sent him. Every connection, every transaction, seemed to lead back to the enigmatic figure. If Whitman was the puppet master behind Charlotte's disappearance, he was also the key to understanding the true extent of the conspiracy. The silence was broken by a knock at the door. Vivian entered cautiously, her expression resolute but tinged with uncertainty. "We need to talk," she said. Nathaniel gestured for her to sit. "I'm listening." Vivian hesitated before speaking, her voice low and deliberate. "I didn't tell you everything last night. There's more about Whitman you need to know." Nathaniel leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "What else? Don't hold back." Vivian clasped her hands together tightly. Whitman wasn't working alone. He had powerful allies, people in law enforcement, politics, even social services. That's how he kept the adoption network running for so long without getting caught. And that's how he covered up Charlotte's abduction. Nathaniel's fists clenched. "Do you know any of these allies?" Vivian nodded. "Some names, but the one that matters most is Thomas Carter. He was a high-ranking official in child welfare at the time. He signed off on nearly every illegal adoption Whitman arranged." "Is he still alive?" Nathaniel asked. "Yes," Vivian said grimly, "and I know where to find him." Meanwhile, Laura wandered aimlessly through the mansion's garden, her mind swirling with conflicting emotions. Vivian's return had stirred something deep within her, a faint but undeniable sense of connection, but it also brought pain. the kind that came with realizing how much had been stolen from her. She sat on a stone bench, staring at the delicate roses blooming nearby. She thought about Margaret, the woman who had raised her, and the quiet life they'd shared. The idea that Margaret had been complicit in such a dark scheme felt like a betrayal, even though she couldn't ignore the love and care Margaret had given her. Lost in thought, Vivian's voice interrupted her reverie. Laura looked up to see Vivian standing a few feet away, her expression soft but hesitant. "Something like that," Laura replied, her tone guarded. Vivian sat beside her, the silence between them stretching for a moment before she spoke. "I know this is overwhelming. I can't imagine what you're feeling right now," Laura sighed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't even know what I'm feeling. Confused, angry, sad, but also curious. I want to know the truth, but I'm scared of what I might find." Vivian reached out, placing a gentle hand on Laura's. "You're braver than you think, and no matter what, I'm here now. I'll help you through this." Laura looked at her, the walls she'd built around herself beginning to crack. "I don't know if I'm ready to call you my mother. Not yet." Vivian nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I understand. I'll wait as long as it takes." That evening, Nathaniel, Vivian, and Laura gathered in the study to discuss their next move. The room was dimly lit, the shadows playing across their faces as they pored over the files and notes spread across the desk. "Carter is the next link in the chain," Nathaniel said, his voice steady. "If he worked with Whitman, he'll know where to find him, or at least how to track him down." "And what happens if Carter won't talk?" Laura asked, her tone apprehensive. Nathaniel's expression darkened. "Then we'll make him talk." Vivian placed a hand on his arm. "We need to be careful, Nathaniel. These people aren't above using violence to protect their secrets. We can't go in blind." "I'm not planning to," Nathaniel said. "But I won't let fear stop us. Not now." The following day, the trio set out for Carter's estate, a sprawling property in upstate New York. As they approached the grand house, Nathaniel felt a mix of anticipation and unease. He wasn't sure how Carter would react to their visit, but he was prepared for anything. A butler answered the door, his expression polite but wary. "Mr. Carter is not expecting visitors," he said. "He'll want to see us," Nathaniel replied firmly. "Tell him it's about Whitman." The butler's eyes flickered with recognition, and he disappeared inside a few minutes later. He returned, gesturing for them to enter. Carter was waiting in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was a man in his 70s, with sharp features and an air of calculated authority. His eyes narrowed as Nathaniel, Vivian, and Laura entered. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Carter asked, his tone cool. "We're here for answers," Nathaniel said, stepping forward. "You were part of the adoption network. You worked with Whitman." Carter's expression didn't change, but his grip on the glass tightened slightly. "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me," Nathaniel said, his voice rising. "You signed off on Charlotte's abduction. I have the documents to prove it." Carter's jaw tightened, and he set the glass down. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he said, his tone icy. "Whitman isn't just a man. He's a system, a ghost, even if I told you everything. You'd never find him." "Try me," Nathaniel said, his voice low and dangerous. Carter hesitated, his gaze flicking to Vivian and Laura. "You're in over your heads," he said finally. "But if you're determined to dig your own graves, I'll give you what you want. Whitman's real name is Harold Whitaker. He's a former government agent who went rogue years ago. Last I heard, he was hiding in Europe." Nathaniel's fists clenched. "Where in Europe?" "I don't know," Carter said. "But if you want to find him, follow the money. He always leaves a trail." The trio left the estate with more questions than answers. As they drove back to the mansion, Nathaniel's mind churned with possibilities. The name Harold Whitaker felt like a key to a locked door, but the path to finding him would be treacherous. Laura sat in the back seat, her thoughts racing. She wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't stop until the people who had stolen her life were held accountable. Vivian glanced at Nathaniel, her expression grim but determined. "We're getting closer," she said. Nathaniel nodded. "But the closer we get, the more dangerous it becomes. We need to be ready for anything." The mansion was quiet, almost unnervingly so, as the trio returned from their confrontation with Thomas Carter. The revelations about Harold Whitaker had left an indelible mark on all of them. The name itself carried an air of danger, a man who had eluded justice for decades. Now, they were tasked with tracking him down, a ghost hidden somewhere in the shadows of Europe. Nathaniel sat in his study late into the night, the dim light of his desk lamp casting long shadows over the papers and maps spread before him. Every lead pointed to Whitaker's financial dealings. If they could find where his money flowed, they could find him, but it wouldn't be simple, and it certainly wouldn't be safe. Vivian entered quietly, her presence almost soothing in the heavy silence. She poured herself a glass of whiskey and sat across from Nathaniel, her gaze steady. "You're thinking of going after him, aren't you?" she asked. Nathaniel looked up, his expression resolute. "It's the only way to put an end to this. He's the one who orchestrated Charlotte's abduction. If we don't stop him, he'll continue to ruin lives." Vivian sighed, taking a sip of her drink. "Do you think it's worth the risk? Whitaker isn't just a man. He's a network. And if Carter was right, there are people protecting him." "I don't care," Nathaniel said firmly. "This isn't just about justice. It's about giving Charlotte, Laura, closure. She deserves the truth." Vivian nodded slowly. "Then we'll do it together." The next morning, Nathaniel gathered Vivian and Laura in the library to discuss their next steps. Laura sat on the edge of her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of what the future might hold. "We're going to follow Whitaker's financial trail," Nathaniel began, his voice steady. "Thomas has already started tracking his accounts. If we can find out where he's operating from, we'll go there and confront him." Laura's eyes widened. "We're going to Europe." "Potentially," Nathaniel replied. "But this won't be a straightforward trip. Whitaker is dangerous, and the people around him are even more so. This isn't just about finding answers. It's about making sure we come back alive." Vivian placed a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder. "You don't have to come if you're not ready." Laura shook her head. "No, I need to see this through. If Whitaker is the reason my life was stolen from me, I want to face him." Nathaniel's gaze softened. "Then we do this together." Over the next few days, the mansion became a hub of preparation. Thomas sent over detailed reports on Whitaker's movements, highlighting transactions that pointed to a small town in Switzerland, a secluded area where Whitaker had reportedly purchased property under an alias. It was the most promising lead they had, and they decided to act on it as the day of their departure approached. Laura struggled to reconcile her emotions. Part of her felt a growing resolve, a need to confront the man who had torn her life apart. But another part of her was terrified, of the danger, of the truth, and of what it might mean for her future. Vivian, sensing her unease, found her in the garden one evening. The setting sun bathed the flowers in a warm glow, but Laura barely noticed, her mind elsewhere. "Penny for your thoughts?" Vivian asked gently. Laura glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I'm just trying to figure out how I ended up here. A month ago, I was a housekeeper trying to pay rent. Now I'm about to go halfway across the world to confront the man who stole me." Vivian reached for her hand, her grip firm but comforting. "You're stronger than you realize. I've seen it in the way you've handled all of this. You have every right to be scared, but you also have every right to fight for the truth." Laura nodded, her resolve hardening. "I just want this to end. I want to know who I really am." "You're my daughter," Vivian said softly. "That's one thing I'll never stop believing." The day of their departure arrived with an air of nervous anticipation. Nathaniel, Vivian, and Laura boarded a private jet arranged by one of Nathaniel's trusted associates. The flight to Switzerland was long but quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they descended into Zurich, Nathaniel briefed them on the plan. Whitaker's property was located in a remote village outside the city, a place where the locals were unlikely to question his presence. They would approach cautiously, observing from a distance before making contact. "We don't know how many people he has with him," Nathaniel warned. "We have to be prepared for anything." The drive to the village was tense, the winding mountain roads offering stunning views that none of them could appreciate when they finally arrived. The air was crisp and cool, the sound of birdsong mingling with the rustling of trees. Whitaker's property was a sprawling estate surrounded by dense forest. They parked a safe distance away and used binoculars to survey the area. A few guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements precise and practiced. "This isn't going to be easy," Vivian said, lowering the binoculars. "He's expecting something. Or someone." Nathaniel nodded. "That's why we wait. We watch, and we strike when the moment is right." Laura swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. She had come this far, but now that they were on the brink of confronting Whitaker, the reality of the situation felt overwhelming. Vivian placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We're in this together," she said softly. "No matter what happens." Laura nodded, drawing strength from her mother's words. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged, not just to a family, but to a purpose. As night fell, the trio settled into their makeshift camp, their eyes fixed on the estate. The darkness seemed to amplify every sound, the forest alive with rustling leaves and distant howls. Nathaniel checked his watch, his mind racing with plans and contingencies. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "We make our move." Laura and Vivian exchanged a glance, their resolve mirrored in each other's eyes. They knew the stakes were high, but they also knew they couldn't turn back now. The morning air in the Swiss countryside was crisp and filled with the scent of pine. Nathaniel, Vivian, and Laura awoke early, their nerves taut with anticipation. The trio had spent the night observing the estate from a distance, noting the guards' patrol patterns and the layout of the property. Now, as the sun broke over the horizon, the moment to act had arrived. Nathaniel crouched over a map of the estate, spreading it across the hood of their vehicle. "There's a gap in their patrol near the west side," he explained, his voice steady but firm. "It's small, but it's our best chance to get inside unnoticed." Vivian nodded, her gaze flicking to Laura. "Stay close to us. We don't know what we'll find in there." Laura swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm ready," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. The three moved swiftly through the forest, the undergrowth crunching softly beneath their boots. They reached the estate's perimeter, a tall iron fence topped with barbed wire. Nathaniel motioned for silence as he clipped the wire with a pair of cutters, creating a small opening for them to slip through. Once inside, they pressed themselves against the side of the main building, their breaths shallow. Nathaniel peeked around the corner, noting the position of the guards. "Wait for my signal," he whispered. When the path was clear, they darted across the open courtyard, their movements silent and deliberate. They entered the estate through a side door, finding themselves in a dimly lit corridor that smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and damp stone. "Where would he be?" Laura whispered. Nathaniel scanned the corridor, his instincts kicking in. "He'll have a room with high security, somewhere he can monitor everything. Likely near the center of the house." They moved cautiously through the maze-like hallways, avoiding the occasional guard. The tension in the air was palpable, every creak of the floorboards making Laura's heart leap. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a heavy oak door with a keypad lock. Nathaniel pulled out a small device Thomas had given him, designed to hack electronic locks. As he worked, Vivian and Laura kept watch, their ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. With a soft click, the lock disengaged. Nathaniel pushed the door open, revealing a large office filled with bookshelves, a massive desk, and several monitors displaying live security feeds of the property. At the center of the room, seated in a high-backed leather chair, was a man who exuded quiet menace, Harold Whitaker. He looked up as they entered, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "Nathaniel Grant," he said, his tone calm and almost amused. "I've been expecting you." Nathaniel stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You know who I am. Then you know why I'm here." Whitaker leaned back in his chair, his gaze flicking to Laura. "And you've brought Charlotte," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "How poetic." Laura stiffened, the sound of her birth name on his lips sending a chill down her spine. "You stole me," she said, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. "You destroyed my life." Whitaker tilted his head, feigning innocence. "I didn't destroy your life. I gave you a new one. Without me, you'd have been just another privileged child, growing up in a gilded cage." Nathaniel took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You took my daughter, tore my family apart, and sold her like she was property. And now you're going to answer for it. Whitaker's smirk faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Do you really think you can touch me? I've built my empire on secrets and power, Mr. Grant. If you've come here for justice, you're sorely mistaken. Vivian spoke up, her voice steady despite the fury burning in her eyes. You're not untouchable. Whitaker, we have your name, your connections, everything. The world will know who you are. Whitaker laughed, the sound chilling in its confidence. Do you think the people I've worked with will let you walk out of here alive? You've stepped into a game you can't win. Before Whitaker could say more, Nathaniel lunged, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the desk. You're going to tell me everything, he growled. Every name, every deal, every family you destroyed. Whitaker struggled against Nathaniel's grip, but his smirk returned. Even if I did, what would you do with it? The system protects people like me. Nathaniel's grip tightened, but Vivian placed a hand on his arm. Nathaniel, she said softly, don't stoop to his level. We need him alive. Nathaniel released Whitaker with a shove, his chest heaving with rage. Whitaker adjusted his collar, his composure intact. Smart woman, he said, eyeing Vivian. But it won't matter. Laura stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. You think you've won, but you haven't. My life isn't yours to control anymore. Whatever power you think you have, it ends here. Whitaker's gaze lingered on her, something almost resembling respect flickering in his eyes. Spoken like a true Grant, he said. Perhaps I underestimated you. Before they could press him further, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the hallway. Guards. Whitaker's smirk deepened. It seems your time is up. Nathaniel glanced at Vivian and Laura. We need to go now. They moved quickly, exiting through a side door as the guards entered the office. Shots rang out behind them, shattering the tense silence. Nathaniel shielded Laura as they sprinted through the forest, their breaths ragged. When they reached their car, Nathaniel turned to Thomas, who was waiting inside with the engine running. Drive, he ordered, and they sped away from the estate. As they crossed the Swiss border into France, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. They had faced Whitaker and uncovered the extent of his power, but the battle was far from over. Laura sat in the back seat, her hands trembling as she replayed the encounter in her mind. What happens now? She asked. Her voice barely audible. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression resolute. Now, we expose him. Every connection, every crime. He won't get away with this. Vivian placed a reassuring hand on Laura's. We'll make sure he pays for everything he's done. Together. For the first time in years, Laura felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead would be dangerous, but she knew she wasn't alone. They would fight for justice, not just for her, but for every life Whitaker had destroyed. The drive back to the French border was tense, but filled with a newfound determination. The encounter with Harold Whitaker had shaken them, but it had also given them clarity. The man was not invincible. His empire, built on secrets and shadows, had vulnerabilities, and Nathaniel was prepared to exploit every single one. As they reached the safety of a small hotel in Lyon, Nathaniel, Vivian, and Laura gathered in their shared suite to strategize their next move. The tension between them had shifted, replaced by a sense of unity forged in the fire of their shared mission. Nathaniel spread out the files Thomas had sent, as well as notes they had gathered from their confrontation with Whitaker. We have his name, his location, and the framework of his operation, Nathaniel began, his voice steady. Now we need to dismantle it. How? Laura asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. He's got people protecting him. Guards, allies, even governments. We expose him, Vivian interjected. We take everything we know to the authorities, the press, anyone who will listen. Nathaniel nodded but hesitated. It's not just about exposing him. We need to ensure he's held accountable. If we move too soon, he could slip away. Laura leaned forward, her expression resolute. Then we need to hit him where it hurts. His finances. Without money, he loses his power. The next morning, Nathaniel contacted Thomas, who had been tirelessly working in the background to track Whitaker's financial dealings. The call crackled slightly, but Thomas's voice came through clear and urgent. I've been digging into his accounts, Thomas said. He's got offshore holdings in the Caribbean, shell companies in Eastern Europe, and properties scattered across Switzerland and Italy. But the crown jewel is a private vault in Zurich. That's where he keeps his records, cash reserves, and blackmail material. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. If we take the vault, we take him down. It won't be easy, Thomas warned. The vault is heavily secured, and Whitaker will know the moment someone tries to access it. I don't care how dangerous it is, Nathaniel said. If we can get our hands on that information, we can end this. Vivian and Laura listened as Nathaniel relayed the plan. Laura's heart raced at the thought of breaking into a secure vault, but the fire in her chest, the need for justice, burned brighter than her fear. I'm in, Laura said, her voice firm. Whatever it takes. Vivian gave her a small, approving smile. Me too. This ends now. Nathaniel placed a hand on both their shoulders, his gaze steady. Then we do this together. The following days were a blur of preparation. Nathaniel tapped into his extensive network to acquire the tools and resources they would need for the mission. While Thomas worked remotely to provide real-time intelligence, Vivian and Laura trained with Nathaniel, learning how to navigate high-pressure situations and communicate effectively under stress. As the day of the operation approached, the trio's bond deepened. Nathaniel and Vivian worked seamlessly, their shared history lending them an unspoken understanding. Laura, though nervous, impressed them with her resilience and quick thinking. You're stronger than you know, Nathaniel told her one evening as they reviewed the plan. You remind me of your mother. Laura looked at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. I just want to make things right. For all of us. The night of the operation arrived, and they drove into Zurich under the cover of darkness. The city's quiet streets offered little indication of the storm brewing beneath the surface. The vault was located in an unmarked building in the financial district, its exterior blending seamlessly with the surrounding architecture. Nathaniel, dressed in a sleek black suit, led the way, with Vivian and Laura close behind. Thomas was in their ears via a secure earpiece, guiding them through the layout of the building. The entrance is clear, Thomas said. You'll need to bypass the first layer of security at the front desk, Vivian. That's your part. Vivian approached the desk confidently, flashing a forged ID that Thomas had provided. She engaged the receptionist in a brief but convincing conversation, giving Nathaniel and Laura enough time to slip past the security cameras. Nice work, Thomas said as they regrouped in a stairwell. The second layer is a biometric lock, Nathaniel. You've got the override device. Nathaniel worked quickly, his hands steady despite the tension. The device hummed softly as it bypassed the biometric scanner, and the door clicked open. You're in, Thomas said. The vault is down 2 levels. Watch for guards. As they descended deeper into the building, the air grew colder, and the hum of security systems filled the space. The vault door loomed ahead, an imposing steel barrier that seemed to radiate power. This is it, Thomas said. You've got 5 minutes to breach it before the alarm system resets. Nathaniel pulled out the final tool, a high-tech drill designed to penetrate the vault's locking mechanism. As he worked, Laura and Vivian stood watch, their eyes scanning the hallway for any signs of movement. 2 minutes left, Thomas warned. Nathaniel's heart pounded as the drill whirred to a stop. With a loud clunk, the vault door unlocked and swung open. Inside were rows of shelves filled with files, hard drives, and cash. It was the heart of Whitaker's operation. Grab everything, Nathaniel ordered. Vivian and Laura worked quickly, stuffing documents and drives into bags. As they moved, Laura's eyes fell on a stack of photographs. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Dad, she whispered, holding up a picture. It's me, as a child. Nathaniel's stomach dropped as he took the photo from her. It was Charlotte, Laura, sitting in a garden, her face frozen in an innocent smile. The picture was stamped with a date. October 1998. Their triumph was short-lived. An alarm blared through the building, the sound deafening. Thomas's voice crackled urgently in their ears. You've got company, get out now. Nathaniel grabbed Laura's hand. Pulling her toward the exit, Vivian followed close behind, her face set with determination. Guards flooded the hallway, but the trio moved with precision, dodging and weaving through the chaos. When they burst into the cool night air, their car was waiting. Thomas was behind the wheel, and he sped off the moment they climbed in. You got it, Thomas asked, glancing at the bags in the back seat. We got it, Nathaniel confirmed, holding up the photo. "And now we take him down." As they drove into the night, Laura clutched the photo tightly, her resolve solidifying. For the first time, she felt like she was reclaiming her identity, not as a victim, but as someone ready to fight for justice. Nathaniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror, pride shining in his eyes. "This isn't over yet," he said, "but we're closer than ever." Vivian placed a hand on Laura's shoulder, her touch warm and reassuring. "We'll finish this, together." The early morning light bathed the streets of Zurich as the car sped toward the safe house where Thomas had set up a temporary base. Inside the vehicle, tension hung thick, but there was also a palpable sense of accomplishment. The bags filled with evidence represented not just a victory, but a chance to dismantle the empire that had destroyed countless lives. Laura sat in the back seat, her fingers tightly gripping the photo of herself as a child. She couldn't stop staring at the image, the proof of her stolen past. It was both haunting and liberating, a symbol of everything she had lost, and everything she was determined to reclaim. At the safe house, Thomas was already preparing for the next steps. The team quickly unloaded the evidence and spread it across a large table. Hard drives, financial records, transaction logs, and personal correspondence painted a damning picture of Whitaker's operation. "This is enough to blow the whole thing wide open," Thomas said, his voice filled with awe and determination. "Once this goes public, Whitaker won't have anywhere to hide." Nathaniel nodded. "We're not just going public. We're taking this to the authorities, the media. Anyone who will listen. He's going to pay for what he's done." Vivian stood beside him, her gaze steady. "And his allies. Every name in these records needs to face justice. No one gets to walk away from this." Laura hesitated, her voice soft but firm. "What about me? What happens when all of this comes out? People will know who I am, or who I was." Nathaniel turned to her, his expression gentle. "You're not defined by what happened to you, Laura. You're stronger than that. This is your chance to reclaim your story." Vivian placed a reassuring hand on Laura's shoulder. "You'll always have us, whatever happens. We're in this together." The plan unfolded quickly. Thomas coordinated with trusted journalists and legal contacts, ensuring the evidence would be delivered securely and simultaneously to key figures around the world. By the afternoon, news outlets were already picking up the story. Headlines screamed of a massive child trafficking ring, implicating powerful figures in government, business, and law enforcement. Whitaker's name was at the center of it all. Nathaniel watched the news unfold with a grim satisfaction. He had waited 25 years for this moment, and now, the world was finally seeing the monster who had stolen his daughter. Whitaker's response was swift and predictable. Within hours, his lawyers issued statements denying the allegations, claiming the evidence was fabricated, but the weight of the documents was undeniable, and soon, authorities in Switzerland and beyond began freezing his assets and issuing warrants for his arrest. That evening, as the family gathered in the safe house, a breaking news alert flashed across the television. Whitaker had been apprehended at a private airstrip, attempting to flee the country. Laura's breath caught as she watched the footage of him being escorted away in handcuffs, his face devoid of its usual smug confidence. For the first time, he looked small and powerless. "It's over," Nathaniel said, his voice filled with quiet triumph. "He's finally going to pay." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Whitaker's arrest led to a cascade of revelations, as his network began to collapse under the weight of public scrutiny. Former allies turned on him, trading information for reduced sentences, and the full extent of his crimes came to light. For Laura, the aftermath was bittersweet. She struggled to reconcile the life she had lived with the life that had been stolen from her. The world now knew her as Charlotte Grant, the long-lost daughter of a powerful family, but she still felt like Laura Brooks, a young woman trying to find her place in a complicated world. Vivian, ever supportive, encouraged her to embrace both identities. "You don't have to choose," she told Laura one evening as they walked through the garden of the safe house. "You're allowed to be both. Charlotte is your past, but Laura is who you've become. Both are part of you." Nathaniel, too, worked to rebuild their relationship. He was careful not to push, giving Laura the space she needed while making it clear he was there for her, slowly but surely. They began to find a rhythm, a tentative but growing bond that gave them both hope. Months later, as the dust began to settle, Nathaniel, Vivian, and Laura returned to New York. The mansion, once a place of grief and solitude, now felt alive with possibility. The staff welcomed them back warmly, their whispers of the family's triumphant return filled with admiration. In the library, Nathaniel stood with Laura, holding the photograph she had found in Whitaker's vault. He placed it in a frame and set it on the mantel, a symbol of their journey. "This is where it all started," he said quietly. "And this is where we begin again." Laura nodded, her gaze steady. "It's not going to be easy." "No," Nathaniel agreed. "But we've come this far. We can face anything." Vivian joined them, her arms wrapping around both of them. "Together," she said with a smile, "we're stronger together." In the months that followed, Laura began to carve out a new life. She returned to school, pursuing a degree in social work, determined to help others who had experienced similar trauma. Her relationship with Nathaniel and Vivian grew stronger, their shared pain forging an unbreakable bond. Whitaker, meanwhile, faced trial in Switzerland, his crimes laid bare for the world to see. The courtroom was packed with survivors, journalists, and advocates, all bearing witness to his downfall. Laura attended the trial, sitting between Nathaniel and Vivian as the verdict was read, guilty on all counts. As they left the courthouse, Laura felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Justice had been served, and while it wouldn't erase the past, it gave her hope for the future. One evening, back at the mansion, Laura stood on the balcony, gazing out at the city lights. Nathaniel joined her, his presence steady and comforting. "Do you ever think about what might have been?" she asked softly. "All the time," Nathaniel admitted, "but I've learned not to dwell on it. What matters is that we found our way back to each other." Laura smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "Thank you for never giving up." Nathaniel placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes filled with pride. "Thank you for coming back." As they stood together, the city stretching out before them, Laura felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought her home, not just to a place, but to the people who loved her. And for the first time, she felt truly whole,